Hey, hello and welcome to the Big Eye podcast today. And I think it's our fourth installment since we've started. And my special guest today is Rick Mayne, an old Ironton High School alumni. And I'm sure many of the Fighting Tiger fans and people around town will recognize you immediately, Rick, as former voice of the Fighting Tigers and on radio and just around. You still frequent a lot of ball games. I know when you were up here, so it's a pleasure having you on today. And how's things going today?
Well, it's going very well, and you mentioned this is the fourth one of these you've done. I kind of like being the cleanup hitter here. In the old Rhino softball days, they never put me in the cleanup spot, so this is rare territory for me.
This is the second straight podcast that we've had a Rhino reference, and I know Jim Hacker. He's got to be really pleased with those references. Are you guys getting some sort of kickbacks, or or is there some sort of reward for bringing up the Rhinos?
Yeah, it's got like so many mentions, and you have bonus incentives in your contract. Uh, it's one of the reasons I hope that we're talking today, though, Jay. I've not actually lived in the city of Ironton for now just over 37 years. After Lola and I got married, we lived in a number of places, mostly right across the river in Kentucky.
Right.
I married a Kentucky girl, and we lived in Ohio briefly. We lived in Proctorville for about 3 years. And then of more recent vintage, been in Florida for 3.5 years and just now relocated back to Central Ohio. So, but the thing with the Rhinos, it's this bond, and you know it, you see it. I'd like to say it comes from because we played so many ball games together, and you develop the kind of bond that athletes do. And we did have athletes that played in our group called the Rhinos, but it was mostly City League softball and some tournaments. And I think it was more we enjoyed each other's company, and then because of that, and we all stayed in kind of close contact. And even though I floated away from the city itself, some of the very best friends I have on the face of the earth are still there and still live. I'm talking to one of them. And that's always a big connection with me. So us 60-somethings are hoping that the weather holds this Sunday, because Coach Hacker has called batting practice,
Look
which
out.
basically means, and you can imagine all the Geritol jokes and all my aching back stuff when somebody bends over to pick up a bat or a ground ball or a glove. But the hook part of it is that we still enjoy each other's company. We still enjoy getting on each other and cutting up and acting a fool. And in most cases, our wives, girlfriends, whatever, they're very tolerant of us pretending like we're still 18, 19, 20-year-old juveniles.
Well, that's an awesome thing to have that bond with the guys for so many years. It was always a pleasure for me to kind of tag along, bat boy some, and in the later years participate a little bit with the batting practice. If I know Hack, it's going to be rain or shine this Sunday, so you might want to get your goulashes out, or whatever you want to call that.
Yeah,
galoshes.
When Hack starts making the rounds and making the phone calls about batting practice, he doesn't really accept no as an answer. And a lot of guys will say, "Oh, I've got this, I've got that." He even actually changed the date. One of our guys, Bill Waller, was involved in a golf tournament last weekend. And he said, if you can move it to the following Sunday, which will be this coming Sunday, he says, that'd be great. So Hack, being in the position to move mountains, moved a couple of mountains, and he said, okay, we're hitting this Sunday.
Coach Hacker.
We'll see how far it goes.
I understand that, Coach Hacker. But, Rick, I had, before we started the podcast, we had a chance to talk a little bit there, and you were talking about watching the broadcast with Mac and Clint McElroy. Mm-hmm. And it got me thinking after our discussion and knowing that you were coming on this week that, I talked with Jason Filia, I talked with Mac, now I'm talking with you. It got me thinking about it's vintage Ironton Fighting Tigers time. We're in the playoff run. A lot of people are excited, even though, not a lot of people are allowed to go to the game still. But that importance of having that voice, and you got to be that voice for a while. And I remember, and I've said this a few times, I know to you, when I was a kid, it was Ken Obel and Bill Ball doing the games. At least I know they did basketball games together.
And Frank Houston. And
Right.
Frank.
Yeah, and Frank was on there, and then it kind of segued, later there. You took over. I think you were the voice there on the '79 team, and I want to get into that '79 team.
Sure.
And then Frank's son Greg was a part of the broadcast or a play-by-play, and then later on with Jason as well.
Yeah, and Frank to Greg, that's quite a legacy. And there were a couple of years I think they actually got to work together, which I'm sure was way cool. Greg and I, being huge sports fans anyway, and because of technology like this, we talk from time to time. We go on streaks. We'll talk a little bit, and we get going on Cincinnati Red baseball and the Buckeyes and the Tigers and all that stuff. So Greg and his dad being able to work together, but you got a really good one in the air chair right now in Jason. I know he doesn't really pay much attention to this. It's something that old guys do to occupy their time. But Jason is by far the longest running person who has ever covered high school sports on radio.
Right.
Probably not only in consecutive years terms, but just as a block of time. And I know probably in some of the situations, because of the Wyro airwaves being owned by a bigger conglomerate, there may have been some situations where he's had to go in and kind of fight for, you don't want to give this up. You don't want to give this up. But I also think that the people in command there understand, and we'll talk about this a little bit in some of the situations I was in, the drawing power and the identification that the Fighting Tigers on radio has still now, even though there's a lot of other options out there of how you can follow high school sports. But you think about Jason and the number of games he has covered in football and basketball and baseball.
Right.
And that's just the Ironton stuff. I know they've done some St. Joseph stuff and some of the county things, but just the Ironton High School, the body of work, that's a lot of ball. And he has, I'm sure, encountered a lot of the typical situations that broadcasters do, particularly when you go away from home. Sure. And the issues that challenge you. But also from a technology standpoint, I was listening to a broadcast from Florida here a couple of years ago, and he was making fun of the fact they had to resort to an old school phone line to get the broadcast on the air. Yeah. And because you've sat there in the booth with him, right, and at courtside at the sports center and elsewhere. But it was, for me in the broadcasting business, is a number one thing.
Well, let me tell you, Rick, that we ran into that this past season. There was some flooding issues out on 93, and we were doing Rock Hill basketball game. And Rock Hill, they have a great facility out there, but you have issues sometimes with Wi-Fi and things like that nowadays. I'll tell you what, that came up. We weren't able to get a line, and Jason was on that just like that. And within 3 minutes, he had us hooked up into a hard line or whatever you all call that speak. And I tell you, he's a real professional.
Well, and that's an extra dimension that I hope his employers realize that they have in him, because a lot of guys, and I saw this happen a lot early in my time, a long time ago doing this, if they would exhaust option one and option two, oh well, and they're up in the stands with the popcorn and just kind of watching the game like everybody else. Right. Mr. Obel, Ken Obel, would not tolerate that. Right. We were going to, and I got caught down in Belfry in this football, and when I showed up and I was doing the game solo, which was difficult, but I was doing the game solo, and when we got to the press box, there were two bare copper wires sticking out of the wall, and it said WIRO on the tag. This is in the very late 90s. And that was the extent of it. And Sam Heighton, who I know you know, and everybody knows, Sam had found a very precarious perch out on a ramshackle piece of plywood out on the press box in front of the windows and out of people's way so he could get his videotape stuff going. And he said, you can come out here if you want. So we ended up doing the game. I had an SUV, and I pulled the SUV up as close as they would allow me to the chain link fence. I lost about 25% of the field down to my left, and I sat on top of my vehicle and called the game. And Sam's son-in-law, the late Larry Mullins, he was my spotter. And he stood right in front of me where I could see him, and he would look down the field. He would call out numbers to me of who was making tackles and running the ball for that part of the field that I could not see.
Those things that you run into that people that are listening to the game have no idea what's going on.
Well, and that night, unfortunately, we didn't get on until probably midway through the first quarter. And so the poor fella back at the radio station was a gentleman by the name of Roger Bentley, who Jason
Sure.
is with.
Roger's still doing it. Yeah.
Good. And he was bombarded by a ton of folks who, where's the game? Where's the game? Where's the game? Where's the game? And I was running around like the proverbial chicken with my head cut off. I think Rick McKnight saw me at one point running back and forth between buildings, and he must have thought I was a crazy man because I'd exhausted about every possible effort. And this, I did it on a bag phone. How does this date it? I'm on a bag phone, cell phone, and caught maybe 2 bars for the signal. So it was very fortunate. So we got the rest of the game, and the Tigers won in real exciting fashion. They made a last-minute stop. Belfry was driving towards the end of the game, and so it did kind of work out. But yeah, that kind of stuff happens. But back towards the point about somebody like Jason, and this kind of thing used to happen where the ownership of the station changed before the big company had the rights to it. It was still, more or less a local concern, but Mr. Auble was retired. But Mike Bertram would make emergency phone calls to Mr. Auble over on Maston Avenue and saying, Ken, I hate to bother you, but we got a problem. Right. And it might have been the home line, or it might have been the visiting team's line. And Ken would scurry down there, and he'd go back underneath the bleachers. About 5 minutes, he'd have it figured out and help the people get on the air. So it all kind of fits in together. But
that's good. That's good stuff and good memories from down there in the heart of coal country. Yeah. Let's talk about 1979's football team. Rick, you and I have talked extensively about that team. I have always likened that team to the team in Hoosiers, the movie Hoosiers. Right. I have thought a lot about that just from the standpoint of an underdog situation. I always thought that whole story would be a good book or film of some sort. But I was watching a little bit of that. I think the late Tim Hodges had posted some of that or most of that game on YouTube, and I was watching on YouTube, and I think somehow they had put your audio with the video or maybe some pictures. But the one thing I remember about that broadcast, I was at the game, but so I wasn't listening to it live, but now going back and listening to it, I still get excited with your call of not only the touchdown, but the 2 extra points that came after that. And I don't know if it was Rhino or Mac. I can't remember who was doing the game with you, but the excitement in both your voices because of being Ironton's first football state championship and just the excitement of the atmosphere, beating a team like that in their backyards. Tell us a little bit about your experience with that team and especially that game.
Okay. And 1979 football season was my first full year of calling Ironton games. I'd done some tournament basketball at the tail end of the previous school year in the late winter, early spring of 79. And then so the football season starts, and there's a million stories that tie into that. And one of the things was getting into the routine of going down on Thursday afternoons at a very set time. Mr. Lutz was very specific. He said, you be here at 2:00. That didn't necessarily mean we're going to record the pregame show at 2:00, but you be here at 2:00. And so I got in the habit of being there at 2:00. And in those days, and I think part of it was, and that coaching staff as well as I do, and even better for having played for them, but I think sometimes just for the sheer sport of it, he would hem and haw around and act like doing the radio pregame show was like having his feet scraped or root canal surgery. he just, and he'd finally go, "Are we going to do this or not?" And we go outside and sit up in the stands and record the thing. But all through the course of the season, there was the thing about the previous year's team had just been monstrously good.
Right.
One of the best teams Ironton ever put on the field. Obviously, not getting the chance to go to the playoff and prove themselves on the field. So when 79 comes along, and Tim Hodges and his teammates, they talked about Joe Fletcher, Brian Jenkins, some of those guys, they talked about it in the later years, Craig Thomas, that we weren't bad. We weren't going to be a bad team. We'd lost some key guys, but we had pretty good set of cats coming back. And the fellows that I just mentioned, and Gabriel Lewis and Steve Sutton and some of the other people that come to mind, Terry Royal, just really good ball players. So the season rolls on, and they lost the one game there because of a strike, Logan, I think it was. And then you get into the playoffs. And in those days, the old AA system, 2 playoff games, the state semifinal and the finals.
Right.
So we played Hamilton-Baden and beat them like 21-6 or something like that. Now, as a sidebar, this is the first time in my time there at WIRO that an effort was made to record the actual broadcast. It's very commonplace now, and everybody does it for lots of different reasons. But it just never occurred to anybody to actually record the broadcast at the studios, at the radio station. So we record the Hamilton-Baden game. Well, then the following week for the championship game, Mr. Auble had been booked for a cruise to the Caribbean or someplace with AAA. And he and Rose, Mrs. Auble, had to leave to take it. So he was leaving the broadcast in the hands of me. And I've thought about this a lot. I'm not real sure why Bill and Sue may have gone with the Aubles on the trip. I don't know. But he was not involved in the broadcast. And I always felt so bad because Mr. Auble missed out on the one time the Tigers did win the state. They went 3 years later in 82, and he was part of that broadcast. But so he misses. So a fellow by the name of Jim Forrest. Jim was from Ashland, Kentucky area, had done radio over there on that side of the creek. And he came over and worked on the air, just like all small stations, sold advertising, did ball games. Jim had not seen the Fighting Tigers play one down in the 1979 season. So Mr. Auble said, "You're going to need somebody to work with you," because in those days, all the commercials were done live from the game.
Okay.
You didn't go back for commercial breaks.
I didn't realize that.
And so Jim was in charge of delivering all the live commercial content. And Mr. Auble said, "This way you'll be able to focus on the game and call the game for people listening back home." So Jim and I go up, and I just visited the Pro Football Hall of Fame the other day in Canton. And that day in 1979, it was regarded more or less as Ironton Day at the hall because Mr. Gallagher, Dick Gallagher, had just recently retired as the director of the hall, and he made arrangements for Ironton fans to come in, I think at a discount price, and see the hall on their way to Akron to the Rubber Bowl.
Yeah, my dad and I went to that.
Yeah, so Jim and I dashed through real quick, and I'm really nervous. I'm kind of like, "Jim, we don't have time to do this. We got to get to the stadium." And then if you remember, we got to the Rubber Bowl. Well, the game in front, the single A game, Covington and Mogador, goes to overtime.
Right.
It pushes things back. And the people at the radio station are kind of hung out to dry because we couldn't get to a phone. There's no cell phones. There wasn't a payphone around anywhere to be found. So they don't know what's going on. They have no idea that this first game is going into overtime. And we finally get through and explain the situation. So then the game starts to play out. And the electricity and excitement just sort of built. I will be forever indebted to Jim Forrest. He knew certainly enough about calling games to recognize individual stuff. And he picked up right away on what a marvelous game Brent Wilcoxon had and how well Tim Hodges was doing in clutch plays, and Joe Hacker with the big fumble recovery, and the execution of the extra point that you talked about, the 3 parts to it. Craig Thomas did not muff a snap in 3 years as the varsity long snapper.
Right.
And he had to do it twice under that pressure situation you were talking about after they tied it up. But I think I said something in the broadcast late in the game. I mean, it was the hair stands on the back of my neck now just thinking about it. The Tigers are driving, and the clock is running down,
Sure.
And they get down close, and I finally told Jim, I said, Jim, I got to stand up. I can't sit down anymore. We had folding chairs in the old Ohio State press box. The Akron press box. And so that last couple of minutes, I'm standing up. And because of being an Ironton guy, and I sort of lost my professional composure, but you couldn't help but get caught up in it. The Ironton guys weren't supposed to be on the same field with, Akron St. Vincent St. Mary.
Yeah, they looked like Notre Dame coming out before the game.
And they had the big kid Jim Carson to tackle, who a number of smaller sized guys on the Ironton line matched up. Johnny Lewis is one of my particularly remember, and Coach Sheridan and the other Coach Lewis and those guys work with those guys to say, we're going to have to come up underneath these cats the entire game to throw them off balance. So the Tigers get down, and Gabriel Lewis. And if you listen real close, I'm setting where players are just before they connected on the tying touchdown. And I just got finished mentioning Joe Fletcher's name. I think, if memory serves correct, Joe will correct me as soon as he hears me talk about this, that he might have been in the slot on that particular formation. But I say Joe Fletcher, and I don't get to finish talk about where he is. So it sounds like Joe Fletcher has handed the ball off to Gabriel Lewis, and he cuts up inside a marvelous block. I think it was John Moritz, late John Moritz with a kick-out block, and Gabriel goes in, and it's just pandemonium.
Oh, yeah.
And Jim and I are high-fiving each other in the press box, and it's very exciting. And so then the extra point deal, and Joe and Craig and Terry Royal was a holder, if I remember correct.
It was either, I think it was Terry Royal or Steve Sutton, maybe.
Steve Sutton, okay.
Yeah.
But all that has to work right twice.
Right.
Offsetting penalties, and they come back and they do it again, the snap and the spot, and Joe kicks it right through. I mean, there's no question it's the biggest place kick in Iron High School history.
Oh, yeah.
Bar none. And there have been some good ones. There have been some long ones and some clutch field goals. So he hits it, and there's still 31 seconds to go. And Jim Forrest, my broadcast partner, he says, we're all celebrating, and we're really happy. 7-6, and it's not supposed to happen. This is not supposed to happen, and it's happening.
Right.
Jim says, hey, the coach has got to tell the kids, hey, boys, we got 31 seconds to go. We got to kick off. We got to defend. And so they do the kickoff. And then I think on the first play, the quarterback for St. M, I think his name was Potter, he tries to throw the ball deep, and Sutton intercepts the pass, runs around, falls down, game over. And then, then the conga line from Akron all the way back down. And it rained cats. It rained all the way up.
Yeah.
It stopped raining during the game. And then as soon as you got back out on the highway heading south, it rained all over again.
Yeah, I remember the one great thing I remember about the broadcast, listening to it again was, and I don't know if it was you or Jim that said it, but one of you said, I don't know if they knew where Ironton was before, but they certainly know where Ironton is now.
Yeah, I remember observations like that. And very, very ironically, 10 years later, when we were talking about the Houstons, Frank and Greg doing a ball game, 10 years later, when the Tigers won their next state championship, the coach for Youngstown had apparently made a very similar observation. Well, I never heard of Ironton. I don't have any idea where Ironton is. And Frank and Greg pointed that out specifically about the coach. I think it was Jim. In 79, I think Jim said, well, people may not have any idea where Ironton was before, but they're sure they're going to know. They're going to look it up now.
I'll tell you a funny story similar to that. In 1982, I was a sophomore on that team.
Yeah.
And we lost the state championship game, but the week before, we played Urbana in the state semifinal.
Right.
I believe Urbana might have been the number one team in the state at the time. I'm not sure. Leading up to the game, their coach, I believe his name was Ray DeCola.
Sounds right.
And he had made a comment about, down there on. He actually made the comment. It was actually not a derogatory comment, but of course, I believe our coaches kind of played it that way to us, and said, they're nothing down there but a bunch of river rats. And I remember after that game, it was a really close game too. One of the greatest things I ever seen a coach do, but he came in our locker room and he mentioned that, and he congratulated us on playing a great game. And that was something special for an opposing coach in a state semifinal and a tough loss to do something like that.
That's very cool. And if you'll clock back to 79 for a minute, in the semifinals, Ironton played Hamilton Baden, and Terry Malone, who for a long time was the state record holder for most number of career games won until Coach Lutz caught him 10, 11 years ago.
Right.
But Terry Malone said in advance of that game, he said, one thing I can tell you about Ironton, and this was from a complimentary standpoint, he said, I just remember, he says, those orange and black uniforms, and he said, and they would just knock your block off.
Right.
I don't know that Baden and Ironton had ever played, but he'd seen Ironton play.
Right.
And Ironton, even at that time, at that level, had the reputation of, well, if you play them, they may not win, they may not be the greatest team, but they're going to hit you, and they're going to keep hitting you. And I always remember that as far as Coach Malone making that observation.
And then that's a great segue into the current team. You know, I was talking about the current team the other day, and I told them the one thing that really stands out to me, and it may be, you know, you may go back a long time, 20, 30 years. I don't know, maybe that long since you've seen a team that's this physical. You know, they play with a lot of physicality. They like to. It seems like they like that type of ball. So, and I don't know if you've got a chance to see them this year, because I know you can't get to the stadium, and maybe you've watched them online. But do you have some comments maybe about the current team that strikes you, as far as you know, what strikes you about the current team?
They address what you're talking about, that physicality, and Ironton teams from times past have had that same element, and that's not to say that certain teams in the last 25, 30 years, and I know that's not what you were saying, didn't do that or couldn't do that, but to this level, to just basically, like Coach Malone said 40 years ago, knock your block off.
Right.
I mean, there's nothing complicated about it. It's got, if you line up against the Fighting Tigers, you better strap it on, because not just one guy, not just one player here, one player there's going to do it. They're all going to do it. And Coach Pendleton and his staff have gotten their kids to buy into that. And as far as seeing them live, haven't seen them live yet this year. Again, because of modern technology, we can watch the video streaming of it and seeing it. I'm old school though, Jay. No discredit to the people that are doing the announcing for the streaming version of it, but I'll turn that down, and I've got Jason and Kevin wound up to listen to it. And I understand sometimes there's synchronizing problems and they don't necessarily go together, but every kid on the team, and if I start naming names, I'll get in a lot of trouble. I recognize them during the course of a broadcast, during the course of a game, but they all seem to be hitters. The big kids on the line, the linebackers, the safeties, the secondary people, they all hit. And you know, when you couple that with the offensive firepower that this team has at its disposal, you get down 2-3 scores against the Tigers, now you're in a lot of trouble.
I agree,
because they're just not going to let up. Now, there have been Ironton teams in the past that could hit, but, and I'm not saying this is the best hitting Ironton team I've ever seen, but they're pretty good. They get after you. And the phrase is, and you know this from being there in town and a huge booster of the program and being there all the time, restore the roar, I think is a very appropriate slogan that goes along with what Coach Pendleton and his staff have done he's in his third year.
right.
Because it's a tremendous source of civic pride, even going back to these guys. I remember Mr. Rolfe, Harold Rolfe, used to talk about the boosterism that the Tanks enjoyed when they were the hot team in town way long time ago. And the Fighting Tigers hold that same kind of fascination, I think, with a lot of people. And I used to think when we were broadcasting the games, and it just seemed like the stands are packed, they're filled, and it's one of the great places you could ever hope to watch high school football, but everybody couldn't be there, which put a lot of import on what we were able to do on radio,
Right.
To convey that, well, maybe you couldn't make it this week, or maybe you're not seeing this team play this season at all, but you know, they're very capable. They're hitting people there. And I think this 2020 team, I don't see enough for the rest of the state of Ohio, but I don't I don't think you would relish playing the Fighting Tigers if they're next up on your playoff round. I know Johnstown's a really good program, and they're perennially in the playoff picture. The Johnnies, right? The
Right,
Johnstown
the
Johnnies.
Johnnies, yeah.
So, when they come to the stadium, just, they've not been in an atmosphere like that before.
I
And
agree.
and I'm sure that part of the message that Coach Pendleton wants his kids to understand is we gotta hit him, gotta hit him again, and we gotta hit him again to the point where they kind of don't want to be hit anymore.
Right, and,
they're,
and
they're really good.
that late in games for sure. It's a very well coached team, and the kids have really worked hard. And it's exciting to see us back to this level. Kind of an expectant level. And that's always exciting too. So, with the little bit time left we got here, Rick, do you have any other kind of broadcasting memories, or maybe some memories about growing up in Ironton or something like that you'd like to share?
Couple things. Broadcasting memory, and last time I saw Coach Bertram, Mike, because he's never let me live it down. And it was the last year that I did Ironton football on a full-time basis. So this is like, I think, 97. And they played over at Ashland. And the kid for Ashland, Jason Nichols, who I think unfortunately has passed away since then, but he was their tailback, and he just had an all-world game.
I agree.
There was no stopping him. He set probably school and Kentucky high school records that night. And it ended up being one of those back and forth kind of things. So Ironton is down by a touchdown, and it's very late in the game. Ashland scores again, and there's like a minute or so left in the game. And I, at that point, as Coach Bertram pointed out, next Thursday when it was time to do Coach's pregame show, he says, I'm listening to the videotape of the game, and I'm watching. He says, and our announcer says, ball game, when Ashland scored with just over a minute to go. He says, I played it back. Now I'm standing there in the office, and he's walking me through this exercise, and it's for his benefit. Mr. Lutz and the rest of them are also there. And Mike is, he's baiting the trap.
Absolutely.
And he says, here's a guy, if you cut him, he bleeds orange and black. And he says, and he just said, ball game. And, of course, they took me to school and said, don't you realize we let them score so we could get a chance to get the ball back? And then they come back with just, one of the most phenomenal. I mean, the fact it was Ironton Ashland is big, but I just in terms of any game. And that kind of sticks out. And there's tons of them. I could go on and on and on, but there's limitations to the time for this. As far as memories of Ironton, I was lucky. I was lucky to have the parents that I did, live in the neighborhood that we did. I just saw Rick Krantz here the other day, and Rick's family and ours grew up across the street from one another down there at the opening portion of Green Valley. And, I mean, we still talk about stuff that happened 50, 55, close to 60 years ago, and it was like it happened last week. Right. It's one of the beautiful things about being from a town where there's parts of Ironton, Jay, I've never actually been in, as amazing as that may seem. Right. Mm-hmm. A street corner or something like that, but what you have as far as your memories and my three sisters and I, we talk about this as a family as well. Just how fortunate we were to live in the time that we did, and to live where we did, and get the opportunities that we did. It was, in your rose-colored glasses way of looking at things, at this stage of life, it's you see hardly anything that was wrong with it. And there was some bumps and things, and there were things you had to learn along the way. But it was just extremely fortunate. And I was extremely fortunate in the broadcasting business to get to do the things that I did, including the association with Ironton Sports. And see, after leaving Wyro, we found ways. We recognized how impactful covering Ironton sports were, and Steve Reinhardt and myself ended up being at a bunch of different stations, and we tell people, say, look, if there's a chance, I don't want to steal WIRO's thunder, but people will follow this if we do that. So we got some additional opportunities because of that, beyond the Wyro stuff. But I wouldn't trade it. I wouldn't trade how we had the opportunity to grow up when we did, and the whole thing about you could go to anybody's neighborhood, and if your mom didn't know what was going on, the moms in that neighborhood knew what was going on. They call and they say, "We're sending them home." It's way past supper time, and you're playing ball or goofing off or whatever. It's just it was a special place, and it still is. And not just because of my personal slant on it with friends being there, but it's got and you see this reflected a little bit in the football team. It's got a toughness that we may be down, we may be having some bumps in the road, but this town's been around for 171 years, whatever it is, and it's we're not going to let it go.
It's that pig iron, right?
Yeah, and people are taking steps, and they're trying really hard to keep things on with positive traction. So that's and I don't hesitate for a minute. When I was down in Florida, I tell people where I was from, and certainly where I am now. I'm glad that I was somebody that got the chance to grow up in Ironton, Ohio.
I echo those sentiments, almost to a T. Grew up in a great neighborhood. I went to great schools. I've often said that America is formed on the school playground in many ways, and especially in a town like Ironton. And you learn a lot of things, and you learn a lot of things about great people here, which is great.
Absolutely. Well, Rick, and we talked a lot about the football side of it, Jay, but the families that are all connected to that, that played ball, and in their families and in their neighborhoods, the parts of town that they're in, and football is good because it's a common web for a lot of people, common weave, but just in general, there's just a lot of good people there in Ironton that are trying to accomplish good things because they like it and they want to see it keep moving forward. And I'm one of the biggest cheerleaders to hope that keeps happening.
That's great. I really appreciate you coming on today, Rick. You and I think, could talk for about 3 hours. I don't know that anybody that's listening to this would want to hear us for 3 hours. I certainly will have you on again in the future. It's like Mac. I had 3 or 4 people tell me, "Oh, you could have him on 2 or 3 times." That's some good stuff. So, and I think I'm gonna have Jason and Coach Pendleton back on here during the playoffs. So we'll have you back. I appreciate you coming on, and good luck this weekend. Make sure you have some of that Blue Emu or Icy Hot or whatever with you for Sunday's practice with Coach Hacker. But
I'm sure you will hear all about it. There's no question.
I'm sure I will. So you have a good time. Tell Lola and the boys we said hey, and thanks for coming on today.
Appreciate you, Jay. Hope to see you very soon. Thanks for the chance to speak up.